Mr. President, I would like to thank the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Tom Fletcher, and the Executive Director of UNICEF, Catherine Russell. We thank them for their briefings, which showed us the true scale of the tragedy of Palestinian civilians continuing in Gaza. Day in, day out, we are seeing the humanitarian situation there, which is plumbing new and new depths. The people in the Strip are living under the conditions of full-scale humanitarian disaster, and they are facing unfathomable hardship and hunger, which kills the adults and children. At the same time, despite the efforts by the humanitarian agencies and basically unanimous support from the Security Council, the humanitarian assistance, which is something that essentially all people in the Strip depend, is arriving in highly restricted amounts, and which are clearly not commensurate with the scale of the disaster. The situation is worsening quickly while there's a critical shortage of fuel, which is needed for the functioning of the basic infrastructure. Without fuel, what could happen is a complete paralysis of the hospitals, water supply systems, and food distribution centers, and that threatens the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. We are particularly worried by the news that there is a possible stoppage of the water desalination facilities. It's unacceptable to have the people in Gaza, children first and foremost, that they are left without access to drinking water. The collapse of the water supply system can also lead to the outbreak of infectious diseases, which would further compound the humanitarian situation. Mr. President, the continued ground operations by the IDF and the artillery shelling throughout the territory of the Gaza Strip create truly impossible conditions, impossible for the survival of civilians. We firmly condemn these attacks, as a result of which civilians are killed and wounded. We are particularly worried by the consistent and clear pattern of strikes against those areas where people congregate looking for food, including near food distribution centers. According to the data from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, no fewer than 798 Palestinians died in the enclave as they were trying to obtain humanitarian assistance, and this is since the end of May this year. We're particularly concerned by a huge number of victims near those centers which are under the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and this is a mechanism, as many of us had warned in this chamber, instead of solving humanitarian tasks, has become a symbol of humiliation of human dignity and is life-threatening for those who need such assistance. Hundreds of people who died when they were trying to obtain assistance is a grim testimony of this fact. The work of this mechanism is dangerous for the beneficiaries and is morally unacceptable. We are convinced the UN Secretariat took the only right and responsible decision when they decided not to participate in this punishment, essentially, scheme under the guise of humanitarian operation. Let me recall here that very recently more than 200 NGOs launched a joint appeal to stop the work of this violent militarized mechanism, where Palestinians are faced with an impossible choice to decide whether they will die of hunger or while they're queuing up for their food ration. Unfortunately, despite all of this, Israel and the United States continue considering this mechanism effective, and they're bragging about the millions of numbers of meals that are supposedly have been passed on to the civilians and not Hamas. These statements are dubious at least and are not supported by the real situation in the Strip. The one thing is clear here. If Israel assisted and not obstructed the humanitarian assistance supplies through the UN, then we would have at least a faint glimmer of hope that the humanitarian crisis would ease. Well, today we do not have such hope, and the massive collective punishment against Palestinians in violation of the basic rules of the IHL is something that's going on in front of our eyes. Mr. President, we are shaken by the recent strikes against the people in Deir el-Balah who were trying to obtain humanitarian assistance from UNICEF. As a result of this attack, tens of people were wounded and killed, and this includes 9 Palestinian children. On the 13th of July, in the Nusayrat camp, according to UN data, 7 more children were killed as they were queuing up for water near a humanitarian distribution center. These tragedies have become a frightful everyday occurrence, and we firmly condemn the killing of innocent civilians who were only trying to obtain the assistance that they vitally need. Such attacks undermine the very possibility of saving human lives and are a gross violation of international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, humanitarian personnel are also continue dying. There was another strike against the office of a humanitarian organization delivered on the 10th of July in Gaza, took the lives of 3 more humanitarians. This tragic incident once again shows how high the risk is that humanitarians are facing when they are doing their duty under the conditions of constant present danger. In parallel to attacks against humanitarians and the reporters who are covering Gaza, there is a true persecution unfolding against UN bodies which are out of favor. And this refers to UNRWA first and foremost. And this is the agency which for decades have been helping Palestinians with humanitarian assistance, education, and healthcare. UNRWA's uninterrupted and stable work is a guarantee of survival for the millions of Palestinians who are living not just in Gaza, but, as we all know, also in neighboring countries, the countries which took in refugees. Would like to underscore here that there has never been an alternative to UNRWA. And after UNRWA and the UN Secretary General, they went after the special procedures under the Human Rights Council. Such acts are not in line with the duties of a UN member states. They are in violation of the Charter and in violation of the Convention on Immunities and Privileges. This situation requires a very decisive international reaction. The protection and providing for the civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories is a duty of Israel as an occupying power. And this is not something that depends on whether or not it's acceptable for the Israeli leadership. We insist on unconditionally ensuring the safety of civilians. Unfortunately, all attempts by the international community to obtain the very basic principles of humanity being abided by are encountering an all-around support by Washington to its ally. Washington essentially gave to West Jerusalem a carte blanche on any activity against Palestinians. Mr. President, if anyone is thinking that the situation in Gaza could not possibly get worse, well, they're probably wrong. According to the information we are getting, including from Israeli officials, West Jerusalem is preparing a new plan to move 600,000 Palestinians in the so-called humanitarian corridor city in Rafah, south of the Morag military corridor. And the goal here to, in future, concentrate all 2 million Palestinians there, having checked them against their links with Hamas. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philip Lazzarini, has already characterized this plan as, in essence, trying to create a huge concentration camp, the Palestinian inhabitants of which will be deprived of any prospects for their future. We would like to point out here that the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, also shares such an assessment, and he called this initiative a part of a general campaign conducted by the Netanyahu government to conduct an ethnic cleansing and deportation of Palestinians. It would be interesting to hear an assessment of this initiative from OCHA and UNICEF. Mr. President, unfortunately, Gaza is not the only area where the Palestinians are situations so dire. We're very worried by the situation in the West Bank. There we're seeing intensified operations by the Israeli forces, especially in the north. What is being done by West Jerusalem leads to massive destruction, worsens humanitarian crisis, and deprives the displaced families of any hope for a return. We regularly receive information about the killings and violence against the Palestinian, the seizure of territory, and the demolition of their buildings. And this is unacceptable. We call on Israel to immediately stop the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory, to ensure that the people are protected and the humanitarian assistance to civilians is not impeded. They need this now more than ever. It's important also to stop the expansion of settlements, stop the provocations on behalf of the settlers who are publicly humiliating the honor and dignity of the Palestinians. Mr. President, we all in this chamber have said many times that ensuring unimpeded humanitarian access to all of the needy in the Strip under the conditions of a continued military operation by the ADF is essentially mission impossible. Furthermore, it's clear for everyone that using force so as to save the hostages in Gaza is something that has shown to be ineffective. And in this regard, we would like to call on the parties yet once again to reach an agreement on ceasefire with the help of the mediation, such agreements which would result in the release and the exchange of all forcibly detained people. In order for the authorities in Israel to finally lift the blockade of this sector, the Washington has to reject their unconditional support for West Jerusalem, stop covering their violations of IHL, and use their influence to stabilize the situation. We're convinced that there is no alternative to this here. This is the only way that the vicious circle of violence can be broken, and the relaunching of the peace process of the Middle East settlement on the two-state solution can be obtained. The ultimate goal here is to create an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting with Israel in peace and security. The many years of the Israeli-Arab conflict has shown that there is no other alternative peaceful scenario in the Middle East. In this context, we welcome the intent on the part of Saudi Arabia and France to convene an international high-level conference to support the two-state solution at the end of the month in New York, and we plan to participate in it very actively. I thank you.
Before I begin my statement, I would like to comment on the two briefings we heard today. Israel is engaged with various UN agencies in good faith at the highest levels, and it is unfortunate that OCHA has continued to abandon all semblance of neutrality and impartiality in its statements and actions, despite claiming otherwise and claiming to adhere to them here today in this room. While referencing the West Bank and events that took place all the way back in May, both briefers only addressed Palestinian casualties based on information that is presented by Hamas. If it is neutrality and impartiality that our UN colleagues adhere to, why was there no mention, let alone a condemnation, of the terror attack where a 9-month pregnant woman was murdered by Palestinian terrorists and her unborn son was seconded to his wombs 15 days afterwards? Mr. President, Roni and Alma Miran are 4 and 2.5 years old. Like many kids their age, they regularly make pretend phone calls on their toy phones. But unlike most children their age, when their mother, Lishai, asks them who they're speaking to, their answer carries a deep pain. The answer is always the same: Abba, Dad. They ask, "Where are you, Daddy? Are they letting you return to us?" They hug and kiss his photo, not able to physically do so for 21 months. Their father, Omri Miran, has been held hostage by Hamas in Gaza for 649 days. For those two young girls, that's nearly their entire lives without their Abba. Earlier this month, twin sisters Emma and Yuli Cunio, who were themselves abducted by Hamas alongside with their parents on October 7th, celebrated their 5th birthday. What should have been a day filled with balloons, laughter, and joy was instead a somber affair marked by absence and pain, because it was their 2nd birthday without their father, David Cunio, who is still held hostage in Gaza. Their birthday wish was heartbreakingly simple: "We just want Dad to come back home." These are not isolated tragedies. These are not statistics. These are shattered families suffering each day in suspended agony. These are innocent civilians held by terrorists, a horror the world must never normalize, a horror that Israel will not accept. Mr. President, we meet today again to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with a briefing from UNICEF concerning the situation of Palestinian children. Yes, the suffering of Palestinian children and the suffering of children anywhere demands our attention. Yet the glaring silence of this Council about Israeli children, about hostages, murdered toddlers like the Bibas boys, on traumatized survivors who will never see their parents again, on children running for shelter as Iranian missiles rain down on civilian population centers, is more than a technical omission. It is a moral failure. Scores of Israeli children were mutilated, tortured, and murdered on October 7th. Innocent lives cut short by the barbarity of Hamas terrorists. These children were victims of an evil that this Council seems unwilling to address or condemn: Hamas. Instead, we're presented with a narrative that forces Israel into a defendant's chair, while Hamas, the very cause of this conflict and the very instigator of suffering of Israelis, but also of Palestinians, goes unmentioned, unchallenged, and immune to condemnation. Some in this Council seem to forget what caused the humanitarian situation in Gaza. To address the situation without mentioning Hamas's war crimes, hiding weapons in schools, firing rockets from hospitals, using civilians as human shields, is not a humanitarian concern. It is propaganda. And even this additional session held today, a week before an already scheduled dedicated Council session, plays directly into the hands of the terrorists who engineered this conflict. It does not support peace, but politicizes suffering. Rather than requesting concrete consultations to learn about the efforts on the ground, the Council gathers to do the opposite, to pressure one side while absolving the other. There is a serious effort on the ground to achieve a hostage deal. Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington last week to meet with President Trump and other senior administration officials underscored just how committed Israel is in its will to achieve a hostage deal. And Israel continues to closely work with the United States and with Egypt and Qatar on reaching a deal that would bring our loved ones home and would end Hamas's reign of terror. Israel will keep supporting the entry of food, baby formula, medicine, and critical supplies because we believe innocent civilians deserve relief from the agony that Hamas has caused them. But we will not allow that aid to become fuel for terror. And yet, even as aid flows in, Hamas does everything in its power to disrupt it. They loot supplies. They obstruct distribution. They intimidate international aid workers. They fire at aid convoys, steal fuel intended for hospitals, and hoard food for their terrorists. They turn the sufferings of the civilians of Gaza into a tool of leverage, and then blame Israel for the very hardship they manufacture. Anyone who truly cares about humanitarian assistance must be serious about condemning those who prevent it from reaching the people. Let us stop pretending that Hamas is a bystander to this crisis. They are its architect. So I ask, does this Council stand with the effort to improve the situation on the ground, or with those who obstruct it? While this Council speaks of humanitarian suffering, let us provide an update on the real humanitarian action underway. Over the past 2 weeks, Israel, together with international organizations, has facilitated the entry of thousands of tons of humanitarian aid into Gaza, using mechanisms designed specifically to bypass Hamas terrorists and reach the civilian population directly. These efforts have been coordinated with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has now delivered more than 66 million meals to Gazans. In addition, more than 7,500 tons of flour have been delivered to bakeries across Gaza, ensuring bread for families. Today alone, over 130 patients and caregivers, including children, exited Gaza through the Kerem Shalom and Allenby bridge crossings for treatments abroad. So perhaps it's time to put an end to the dissemination of disinformation by some in the Council regarding which paths lead to what. There are paths of cooperation and improvement. Earlier this week, on July 13th, nearly 100 tons of baby formula donated by UNICEF entered Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing, facilitated by Israel. We do wonder why this was omitted from the briefing this afternoon. It should be absolutely clear. The aid is for the civilians in Gaza, not for Hamas, and we will continue to facilitate it. Mr. President, Council members, one cannot claim to care about the children and people of Gaza while ignoring the suffering of Israeli children and hostages still held there. A mere mention, a single reference in a 15-minute presentation is not enough. The empty words will not do. You cannot champion peace while turning a blind eye to those who wage terror. If this chamber truly wishes to ease the suffering of all children, Israeli and Palestinians, then you must confront the root of this conflict, and that root is Hamas. Hamas has built its war machine at the expense of Palestinian lives and futures. It has robbed Gazan children of their innocence, indoctrinating them with hate in their classrooms, using them as human shields, and bearing weapons in their schools and hospitals. Imagine what Gaza could be without Hamas, a place of peace where children learn math, not martyrdom, where aid builds homes, not terror tunnels, where coexistence replaces hate. There are those who wish to work with Israel in good faith, regional partners who cooperate with us to bring hope to children across the region. It can be achieved, but it can only be achieved without Hamas. And it is time for this Council to speak and act with moral clarity to achieve this goal, with demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, deceased and alive, still held in Gaza, by condemning Hamas unequivocally for what it has done to Israelis, but also for what it has caused to the Palestinians, by designating Hamas as a terror organization it is. This is what the Council should be focusing on. Israel, on its part, will continue to work with the US, Egypt, and Qatar to reach a hostage deal and to bring all our loved ones home. Mr. President, to conclude, every child deserves safety. Every child deserves a future. That future cannot be built on hate. Our children, all children, deserve more than this Council's silence in the face of terror. They deserve your voice, and they deserve your action. And Alma, Roni, Emma, and Yuli deserve to hug their fathers again. Thank you, Mr. President.